Is there a Jewish creed?
Several important creedal formulations have appeared at different times in Jewish history. But a good starting point is the single sentence from Deuteronomy 6:4. It is called simply the Shema. Devout Jews recite these few words more often than almost any other phrase. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, or the Lord our God is one Lord. Two essential ingredients in Jewish belief are enshrined here in elegant simplicity. First, the notion that the people constitute a community of faith. And second, the affirmation of the absolute unity of God. In the next verse, Jews are enjoined to love the Lord with all their heart, soul, and strength. Another very ancient text that functions like a creedal statement appears in Deuteronomy 26:5-10. In his final instruction to the people, Moses tells them that when they come into their newly God-given land, they are to make an offering and recite a short historical summary of all that God has done for them. A wandering Aramean was my father, it begins, referring to Jacob, father of the 12 tribes. The text goes on to recount in brief how God rescued the people from slavery in Egypt and gave them a land in which to dwell. Apart from these two biblical texts, the anonymous 15th century, I believe, based on the 13 Articles of Faith of Maimonides, d. 1204, is the best known creedal statement. Each of 13 affirmations begins, I believe, with an unwavering faith. Articles 1 through 5 affirm that God is omnipotent and one, beyond all things material, master of time and space, and the sole object of prayer and devotion. Moses' prophetic authority, along with that of the other prophets as well, Scripture's authenticity and truth, and the finality of the divine law are the subjects of Articles 6 through 9. All the remaining 4 articles speak of the ethical demands of adherence to the revealed law, of the final consequences of human choices in the form of reward or punishment, of the Messiah's eventual coming, and of the ultimate resurrection of the dead.
Is there a Jewish creed?
Several important creedal formulations have appeared at different times in Jewish history. But a good starting point is the single sentence from Deuteronomy 6:4. It is called simply the Shema. Devout Jews recite these few words more often than almost any other phrase. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, or the Lord our God is one Lord. Two essential ingredients in Jewish belief are enshrined here in elegant simplicity. First, the notion that the people constitute a community of faith. And second, the affirmation of the absolute unity of God. In the next verse, Jews are enjoined to love the Lord with all their heart, soul, and strength. Another very ancient text that functions like a creedal statement appears in Deuteronomy 26:5-10. In his final instruction to the people, Moses tells them that when they come into their newly God-given land, they are to make an offering and recite a short historical summary of all that God has done for them. A wandering Aramean was my father, it begins, referring to Jacob, father of the 12 tribes. The text goes on to recount in brief how God rescued the people from slavery in Egypt and gave them a land in which to dwell. Apart from these two biblical texts, the anonymous 15th century, I believe, based on the 13 Articles of Faith of Maimonides, d. 1204, is the best known creedal statement. Each of 13 affirmations begins, I believe, with an unwavering faith. Articles 1 through 5 affirm that God is omnipotent and one, beyond all things material, master of time and space, and the sole object of prayer and devotion. Moses' prophetic authority, along with that of the other prophets as well, Scripture's authenticity and truth, and the finality of the divine law are the subjects of Articles 6 through 9. All the remaining 4 articles speak of the ethical demands of adherence to the revealed law, of the final consequences of human choices in the form of reward or punishment, of the Messiah's eventual coming, and of the ultimate resurrection of the dead.
What does the term Babylonian exile, or captivity, refer to?
The kingdom of Judah had come under military and political pressure in the late 700s BCE. Around the time of the fall of the northern kingdom, some southern kings even paid tribute as vassals to Assyria. In the year 597 BCE, the Babylonians, successors to the Assyrians as the major regional power, were closing in on Jerusalem. Though the city would hold out for another 10 years. The invaders captured and deported to Mesopotamia a number of leading Jews. In 587/6 BCE, the Babylonians laid final siege to Jerusalem, destroying the temple. They and other Middle Eastern powers had found it useful to take important Jews into exile, the better to demoralize the subject peoples and ensure the success of the conquering regime. Exact numbers are impossible to reconstruct, but the total deportation seems to have uprooted as many as 20,000 people. Since only the poorest and least educated were left behind, the exile amounted to a virtually total elimination of Jewish presence in Jerusalem and its environs. The good news was that the community would realize the possibility of taking root in a new land. Prophets preached a message of encouragement and survival, devising a whole new exilic theology built around the hope of restoration and return. Enter the Achaemenid Persian Empire stage left, exit Babylon stage right. Jewish fortunes changed under the new sovereigns of the central Middle East. In 539 BCE, Persian monarch Cyrus the Great decided to release the captives and allow them to return to Jerusalem.
What is the difference between a custom and a ritual?
Custom includes a whole range of activities that people in a particular time and cultural setting become so used to doing that they rarely examine their reasons for acting that way. Custom is the way we've always done things. It includes everything from social expectations and etiquette to the specific kinds of food people serve for special occasions. Common law is a type of customary social norm. Its practices have been in use so long that they have assumed legal status and authority. Custom operates at various levels, from that of a society at large to that of the local community and family. Rituals are typically part of the larger category of custom. But ritual practices tend to follow a rigid sequence in the interest of ensuring that the action is correct. For example, it is customary in certain cultures for participants in a wedding to wear certain kinds of clothes. But wedding rituals mandate specific actions in a set order. Even when the principal participants opt for non-customary fashions.
What was the Holocaust?
The term Holocaust derives from a pair of Greek words that mean whole burnt offering. The term originally referred to a kind of sacrifice performed in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. In more common contemporary usage, however, Holocaust refers to the suffering and death of as many as 6 million Jews during World War II as a result of Adolf Hitler's final solution. Jews all over Europe were systematically targeted by Nazi propaganda and police action. The Shoah, as it is called in Hebrew, began in 1933 and escalated dramatically after Kristallnacht. The Night of Shattered Glass, November 9 to 10, 1938. According to the Nazi view, only a return to Aryan racial purity could save the human race. With their Semitic blood, Jews were a source of racial pollution and needed to be exterminated. Throughout the late 1930s and early 1940s, Hitler and his collaborators, led by the Gestapo, Geheimstaatspolizei, or State Secret Police, and the feared Blackshirt SS, Schutzstaffel, rounded up hundreds of thousands of Jews and herded them into boxcars for transport to concentration camps scattered through Central and Eastern Europe. Many prisoners too small or too weak to work were immediately taken to the gas chambers, often disguised as showers, where they were killed with Zyklon B gas. The Holocaust represents one of history's most extraordinary and horrifying examples of both genocide and scapegoating.
What was the genesis of Rabbinical Judaism?
It may be helpful to think of Rabbinical Judaism as evolving in a long history of classes of religious scholars. The earliest were the Sopharim, or scribes, scholars of the Second Temple period, 400 to 200 BCE, who emerged with Ezra's attempts to restore Torah to the center of Jewish life. From 200 BCE 30 CE, the period of the 5 pairs of teachers, or Zugat, ended with Hillel and Shammai. A school called the Tanaim, repeaters, 30 to 200, lay the foundations of the Mishnah. That would become the first major written systematization of oral Torah. They also initiated a branch of oral Torah commentary called the Tosafta. Additions, collections of statements of Tanaim not found in the Mishnah. Called Birato, meaning outside, arranged according to Mishnaic order. From 200 to 500, the Amoraim, spokesmen, interpreters, communicated lessons of the great rabbis to pupils and later scholars who taught in Babylon. Iraq, in rabbinical academies established after the Babylonian exile. Their work eventually comprised the Gemara, completion, of the Jerusalem Talmud. Completed around 390. From 500 to about 589 a class called the Savraim, reflectors, completed the writing of the Babylonian Talmud but left no independent work. The Janim, eminences, heads of the academies of Sura and Pumadida in Iraq, dominated Jewish scholarship from about 589 to 1000, providing their answers to queries on the Torah from all over the diaspora in a body of literature called responsa, responses. From 1000 to 1400, the Mefarashim and Posachim elaborated on the practical implications of halakha, rules and regulations, and the Tosafists, those who added on, produced collections of comments on Talmud arranged according to the order of the Talmud sections or tractates. They based their writings on comments of earlier authorities, especially the 12th to 14th century school of Rashi in Germany and France. This ongoing layering of tradition turns out to be the complex and multifaceted foundation of what we know as Rabbinical Judaism.
Is there a Jewish creed?
Several important creedal formulations have appeared at different times in Jewish history. But a good starting point is the single sentence from Deuteronomy 6:4. It is called simply the Shema. Devout Jews recite these few words more often than almost any other phrase. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, or the Lord our God is one Lord. Two essential ingredients in Jewish belief are enshrined here in elegant simplicity. First, the notion that the people constitute a community of faith. And second, the affirmation of the absolute unity of God. In the next verse, Jews are enjoined to love the Lord with all their heart, soul, and strength. Another very ancient text that functions like a creedal statement appears in Deuteronomy 26:5-10. In his final instruction to the people, Moses tells them that when they come into their newly God-given land, they are to make an offering and recite a short historical summary of all that God has done for them. A wandering Aramean was my father, it begins, referring to Jacob, father of the 12 tribes. The text goes on to recount in brief how God rescued the people. from slavery in Egypt and gave them a land in which to dwell. Apart from these two biblical texts, the anonymous 15th century I believe based on the 13 Articles of Faith of Maimonides, d. 1204, is the best known creedal statement. Each of 13 affirmations begins I believe with an unwavering faith. Articles 1 through 5 affirm that God is omnipotent and one, beyond all things material, master of time and space, and the sole object of prayer and devotion. Moses' prophetic authority, along with that of the other prophets as well, Scripture's authenticity and truth, and the finality of the divine law are the subjects of Articles 6 through 9. All the remaining 4 articles speak of the ethical demands of adherence to the revealed law, of the final consequences of human choices in the form of reward or punishment, of the Messiah's eventual coming, and of the ultimate resurrection of the dead.
What is excommunication or religious banishment?
Excommunication is the process whereby an individual or group that refuses to give up certain unacceptable views or practices are cut off from the community of believers. Though the juridical procedure is typically associated with the Roman Catholic Church, numerous other religious bodies employ similar practices. From the formal and often technical proceedings of official excommunication to the more informal custom known as shunning, religious communities have always had their ways of removing the weeds and the bad apples. Sometimes religious banishment has served as an alternative to punishment by death, or as a lesser punishment as atonement for sin. Religious banishment in most cases is a reversible sanction. Depending on the individual's willingness to recant and repent.
Are cults different from sects? Are they authentically religious groups?
We've become accustomed in recent years to hearing about various cults, both here and abroad, that claim religious inspiration and legitimacy. Think, for example, of the Branch Davidians of Waco, Texas, the Heaven's Gate group Suicide in California, or the Japanese Aum Shinrikyo, infamous for its nerve gas attacks on Tokyo's subway system. The term cult is sometimes used synonymously with new religious movement. And although there are varying opinions on the subject, it is possible to point out a few salient features. First, both cult and new religious movement are historically relative terms. A movement whose novelty and exotic qualities were so obvious to observers, say 1,000 years ago, might have turned out to be a major religious tradition by our time. Most recent new movements are not truly sectarian in the sense that they are not offshoots of larger religious communities. In addition, cults take the exclusivity that seems to characterize the sect as classically defined and separate themselves from society to a much greater degree than sects. Cults tend to be quite small, often having only one very localized community centered around a charismatic leader who exercises virtually absolute control over members. Cult leaders sometimes claim their authority on the basis of a direct new revelation or special new insight and interpretation of mainstream sources such as the Bible. The leader's direct orders are often the only organizational structure. And when a cult leader dies, the cult often dies with him or her. Some cults seem to be oriented toward an end-time scenario and on occasion seem ready to do whatever they deem necessary to facilitate that end.
How does Jewish tradition interpret history?
Large portions of the Hebrew scriptures are some of the finest ancient historical writing. Authors of historical texts in the Bible do not merely catalog events chronologically. They evaluate their data and pass judgment on the main characters from a particular perspective that views all happenings as part of a greater divine plan. They discern patterns in human behavior and in God's ways of dealing with people. So, for example, the author of the book of Judges observes how, when the people do evil in the sight of God, God allows them to suffer the consequences. Once they've had enough chaos, they cry out to God for help. God then raises up a judge to rule the people, and justice reigns for 40 or 80 years. But when the strong ruler dies, the people again go astray, and the cycle starts again. Judges 2:16-23. History begins when God creates time and space, moves through many generations of human beings struggling with and for each other, and will come to an apocalyptic conclusion at a time known only to God. Above all, history is the arena in which God deals actively with humankind as a whole, but directs both special attention and expectation to the children of Israel.
What is a ritual object or implement?
Ritual objects include a large number of items, both symbolic and practical, that are the essential devices of religious practice. They may be as outwardly pedestrian as containers for the raw materials of religious offering: rice, salt, wine, bread, or the utensils needed to move those materials around. These tools often have no major symbolic meaning but are largely utilitarian, though they are generally regarded as sacred because of the context and are not to be used for non-ritual purposes. Many other ritual objects are more symbolic than practical in function. Every tradition has its symbols for the ultimate spiritual reality, for the various kinds of benefits and blessings believers seek from that reality, and for the gifts devotees bring as offerings. Among the most common are images or icons, books or scrolls of sacred text, lamps, musical instruments, weapons, and special vestments or garb for officiants and sometimes participants.
Are racial and ethnic issues a significant factor in religion?
Race is just as formative an element in the history of religion as gender. When religious traditions expand beyond their regions of origin, they must adapt to new cultural, racial, and ethnic circumstances. If political power accompanies the tradition's expansion, the social balances in the new territory will very likely call for change in the expanding tradition as well as in the lives of the local populations. What one might call religious colonialism often goes hand in hand with cultural hegemony. When a religious tradition is heavily identified with a racial or ethnic group, converts to the tradition may find themselves still second-class citizens. Within the greater American Christian tradition, for example, black churches formed because of de facto segregation. Even though in theory all Christians enjoy equality in the sight of God.
When religion becomes a crime.
The Russian Revolution of 1917 launched a wave of tremendous change in Russia, affecting all aspects and strata of society. When Vladimir Lenin, the principal leader of the revolution, died in 1924, a struggle ensued for control of the party and, by extension, the country. Joseph Stalin emerged as the country's new dictator. By 1929, when longtime rival Leon Trotsky was exiled, Stalin was firmly in power. A ruthless dictator, he quickly set a course of isolationism and nationalism. Policies that would effectively cut the USSR off from much of the rest of Western civilization. Stalin presided over a basic reorientation of Russian culture and society during the 1930s. He instituted severe policies in the realms of art, education, religion, and family life that had a tremendous impact on all Soviet citizens, from the poorest peasant to Moscow's leading intellectuals. This process came to be known as Stalinization. In 1929 laws were passed under which the practice and spread of religion became a crime against the state. Churches were destroyed, priests were stripped of their civil rights, and their children were forced to renounce their fathers or risk death. 3 years later, a program for the total eradication of religion from the Soviet Union was announced. The very notion of God will be expunged as a survival of the Middle Ages and an instrument for holding down the working masses, the official announcement proclaimed. The Communist Party and the Soviet state subsequently established themselves in the place formerly occupied by religion. The study of history, science, the arts, and other subjects also underwent significant change in the 1930s. As the government introduced new conservative standards designed to focus education efforts on increasing worker skills and productivity. Finally, Stalin insisted on a return to traditional family values. Homosexual behavior and abortion were criminalized, divorces were made much more difficult to obtain. and the Marxist-inspired drive for women's emancipation fell into disrepair. To ensure that the masses heeded this new emphasis, it was understood that the state had an obligation to scrutinize all members of Russian society. Thousands were found wanting and were punished severely.
What questions does the prospect of interfaith marriage raise?
Attitudes toward marriage between members of two religious traditions vary considerably. In some traditions, interfaith unions raise relatively little concern, but many others typically either forbid them altogether or take serious official exception and place explicit restrictions on such marriages. Many Muslims and Catholics, for example, continue to hold that interfaith marriages are to be discouraged because of the problems that often arise in the religious education of children. In some communities, it is assumed that the intended spouse from another tradition, most often the wife, will agree either to convert or to see that the children receive solid grounding in the spouse's tradition. In the long run, interfaith marriage holds the potential threat of one tradition's gradual assimilation and loss of identity in favor of a dominant tradition.
How did other Jewish communities develop outside of Israel?
Small pockets of Jews had grown up in various places in the Middle East since at least the early days of the monarchy. Foreign alliances allowed Jewish kings to bargain for power and influence and opened economic doors. With the trade routes came traveling merchants, some of whom decided to relocate. The first major Jewish communities outside of Israel and Judah were the result of the various mass deportations. By the time Cyrus had made a return possible, Mesopotamian communities had been established for over 2 generations. With the threat of imminent persecution lifted by a tolerant ruler, many Jews simply stayed in Iraq. There they founded thriving cultural and religious institutions, including the academies that went on to produce some of Judaism's most important legal and theological works. Under successive political regimes with varying policies toward religious pluralism, Iraqi Jews experienced uneven fortunes, but on the whole did much better than merely survive. During the first several centuries of Islamic rule from the capital cities Damascus and Baghdad, Jews enjoyed considerable autonomy and even held high government office. But after the invasion of the newly Islamized Seljuk Turks from Central Asia, Jewish life in the Middle East changed dramatically. The Seljuk Sultan effectively abolished the offices of Exilarchate and Jayanate, which had been the backbone of Jewish autonomy. Meanwhile, Jewish communities had grown in Europe since Roman times and had begun to thrive in Germany under Charlemagne. Now many Middle Eastern Jews would look to Europe in hopes of another new start. From the 11th century until at least the late 19th, The center of Judaism would shift from the Eastern Mediterranean to Central and Eastern Europe.
What makes important religious practices rituals and ensures that they work?
In addition to the various primary ritual functions are a host of lesser or secondary ritual acts that help participants establish a proper ritual setting and ensure that the actions are maximally efficacious. The setting includes the space, time, and feeling that make a ritual work. Many rituals occur in spaces designated for that purpose. But in some instances separate preparatory rituals are used to mark the boundaries of a ritual space. They can include sub-rituals, such as processions or purification ceremonies. Other sub-rituals establish the boundaries of sacred time. Bell, drums, or calls to prayer may mark the opening and closing of a ritual. Still other rituals enhance a feeling or mood by appealing to the senses. The use of incense burners is an example of a widespread practice. Finally, some traditions assure continuity and purity of rituals with precise instructions on how they are performed. These instructions are often called rubrics. Because they are sometimes printed in red, Latin ruber, to mark them as directions.
What were the achievements of the prophet Moses?
Moses, born circa 1390 BCE, was the son of a Hebrew from the tribe of Levi. His mother was Jochebed. When Moses was just 3 months old, his mother set him adrift in a basket on the Nile to save him from the pharaonic decree that all Hebrew male babies were to be slaughtered in their infancy. A daughter of Pharaoh found the infant Moses and raised him in her household. As a foster son of Pharaoh's daughter, Moses would have been well educated in political, religious, and military affairs, and he would have been given important responsibilities in government upon reaching maturity. Although he could have enjoyed prosperity, power, and respect in his adopted Egypt, he chose instead to associate himself with his downtrodden people. Regarded as a prophet by Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Moses led the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt and through their desert wanderings, delivered to them their law and liturgy which remain to this day, and helped them form their nation. He supervised the construction of the Ark, a symbol of God's presence with Israel, and oversaw the construction of the tabernacle, a tent shrine that was the focal point of the nation's worship. The celebration of Passover was begun in commemoration of the night God spared the lives of the Jewish firstborn sons and slew only the sons of the Egyptians.
What is apostasy?
The term apostasy comes from the Greek compound apostasis, literally standing away or apart from. Hence rebellion or secession. It differs from heresy in several important respects. Heresy involves refusal to accept one or more mainstream doctrinal positions. But those holding the heretical views do not necessarily mean to repudiate the religious tradition altogether. In other words, heresy means a kind of selective rejection of religious teachings, often in the sincere belief that a certain view is simply mistaken. Apostasy implies a blanket rejection of a faith tradition, and a return to former views or to another tradition. So, for example, some early Christians reverted to paganism, and some 7th century Bedouin Arabs who had become Muslims rejected Islam when Muhammad died, and fell back on their ancient tribal ways. Official punishments for both apostasy and heretical beliefs have often been severe, including death, and have depended a great deal on the degree to which religious authorities exercised political clout. In the time of Constantine, apostate Christians suffered very harsh forms of banishment and loss of legal rights.
An important feature in this and other rituals is the emotion or feeling, such as dread or longing or joy. What were the religious sects in America in the 1970s?
In the open cultural climate of the 1960s and 1970s, a variety of religions new to the United States, or previously unnoticed, attracted attention from the press and the general public. Some of these organizations engaged their converts in beliefs and activities that seemed strange by traditional standards. Detractors labeled them cults and warned of their dangers, particularly to the young. Among the best known of these are the following: Hare Krishna. Some of these groups came from India, such as the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, which incorporated itself in the United States in 1966. The organization attracted increasing numbers of young people who were called Hare Krishnas by outsiders. In cities with large numbers of hippies, passers-by encountered Hare Krishnas dressed in saffron robes with distinctive haircuts, performing on the streets. Even more visible were the Hare Krishnas soliciting contributions in airport terminals and other public places. Another popular Indian guru was Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, of transcendental meditation. In the early 1970s, large numbers of people went to one of 350 training centers where they were given a personal mantra, a word they were to use for engaging in meditation. As it was sometimes called, attracted attention from physicians and psychologists investigating the psychic values of meditation. In 1974, the yogi bought Parsons College in Fairfield, Iowa, and renamed it Maharishi International University. When the yogi's followers began to claim that they could levitate and that their meditation could alter world affairs, the movement went into a decline. Moses David, a group that started as a Christian mission to young people in the California counterculture in the late 1960s, took on cult-like qualities when David Berg, The founder of Teens for Christ, began to see himself as the Messiah. He changed his name to Moses David. While the group's name changed several times, it was best known as the Children of God. Berg and his followers established communes on the West Coast and in Texas. Berg himself went to Great Britain, and his movement proselytized around the world. Moses communicated with his followers in letters, called the Mo letters. That spelled out the terms of his developing set of beliefs. In the course of a decade, over 900 of the Mo letters were published, delivering doctrines that departed increasingly from mainstream Christianity, that it fosters in the participants. Other rituals engage the imagination and intellect primarily, allowing participants to enter into another level of experience through meditation or contemplation, for example. Still, other rituals help believers connect in memory with persons now departed or with past formative spiritual experiences they want to recall.
What did the Jerusalem temple look like?
Solomon built the first temple around 950 BCE. After that was destroyed in 587/6 BCE, it was replaced by the Second Temple in about 516 BCE. That in turn was modified many times over the subsequent 5 centuries, most recently by King Herod. Though the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 CE, parts of Herod's construction are still visible as the western, so-called Wailing Wall. Biblical accounts offer detailed descriptions of various components of the temple, filling in some of the information archaeology has yet to unearth. Solomon's temple was in a way a permanent version of the tabernacle described in the Torah. A rectangle about 200 feet long by 40 wide, the temple consisted of 3 chambers. Up a few steps flanked by the 2 columns symbolic of the monarchs, Jachin and Boaz, and just through the east-facing main door was the vestibule. Beyond that was a large windowed room, the Heichal, Great Hall, where most rituals occurred, and the dark Holy of Holies, Dever, shrine, elevated 5 or 6 steps, which only the priestly staff could enter, and where the ark was kept. Surrounding the central building was a huge courtyard with 3 gates on each of its 4 sides. In the Second Temple the central building was larger, and set in the grander context of a series of courtyards. Along the walls of the court immediately enclosing the temple proper were chambers for the sacrificial materials. Directly in front of the temple porch, in the court of the priests, was a large altar for burnt offerings and a small slaughterhouse. Directly east of that, through a gate and down 6 or 8 steps, was the large women's court with corner chambers for lepers, Nazirites, oil, and wood. The Second Temple's shrine held no Ark of the Covenant. Surrounding the entire high platform was an immense wall, some of which remains today.
What is a rite of passage?
In the life of every individual, certain times naturally stand out as particularly significant. Birth, the transition from childhood to adulthood, or puberty. The assumption of a new state in life, as in a marriage, and death are especially critical times. Religious traditions generally acknowledge these and other formative experiences. By developing rituals designed to help people cope with the changes they bring. Sheer difficulty and challenge can sometimes be the distinguishing features of important moments or phases of a life. Confusion, sense of loss and grief, even overwhelming joy or feelings of limitless possibility can be cause for recourse to the comfort and direction rites of passage can afford. Rituals of this kind help believers by allowing them to step out of ordinary time and space for a while to regain their bearings. They can then return to real life feeling renewed, spiritually refreshed, and strengthened for the challenges ahead.
Is there any difference between meditation and contemplation?
Meditation and contemplation are important practices in many religious traditions. The two terms are often used synonymously to refer to a prayerful focus on inner spiritual realities. There are, however, some important differences in the methods used for that focusing. It is helpful to keep in mind that there are variations in both theory and practice among the major religious traditions. In general, meditation involves a non-discursive concentration on some object, either verbal or visual. The idea is not to engage in thinking about the object of focus, but merely to allow it to function as a kind of controlled distraction. By targeting the focal object exclusively, the meditator frees up the mind and spirit to achieve a deeper level of simple awareness. Many traditions follow the practice of having a preceptor or spiritual guide assign a specific symbol to each meditator. That symbol can be a word or a phrase, sometimes called a mantra, repeated slowly and deliberately. It can also be an object upon which the meditator concentrates visually, such as a candle flame or a flower. When a meditator becomes aware that the mind is wandering, the solution is to observe "my mind is wandering" or something similar, and return to concentration. Gradually the number and intensity of distractions dwindle. Some traditions allow that there is important intellectual content in meditation, such as a point of doctrine on which the meditator reflects for deeper insight. Contemplation involves a different method. Here the immediate goal is to enter imaginatively into a spiritual reality, and ultimately to be united with that reality. As its Latin root words suggest, the contemplator seeks to become one with or abide in a sacred place, come, with, and templum, temple. Some traditions hold that contemplation is a state of pure intuition beyond any mental content. Others include in their understanding of contemplation the active imaginative entry into an important scene, as if the contemplator were there with the players in some sacred action. Whatever the precise definition or method used in a particular tradition, it is fair to suggest that meditation precedes and prepares for contemplation.
Is sacrifice an important feature in many religious traditions?
Sacrifice can take a number of forms, from the actual slaughtering of a living being to a more symbolic offering up of something dear to the sacrificer. The Latin root, sacrum, holy, and facere, to make, suggests that the object sacrificed and the one, performing the action become holy or sacred. Some traditions, such as Islam and Hinduism, continue ancient rites of bloody sacrifice by killing animals, either to commemorate some similar act attributed to an important holy person of the past or because a certain deity requires it. In other traditions, ancient sacrificial rituals have been either abrogated altogether, since the destruction of Judaism's temple, or symbolically transformed into an unbloody substitute, as in Christian reenactments of the Lord's Supper.
What is the connection between orthodoxy and heresy, and what is heterodoxy?
Orthodoxy, from the Greek orthodox, correct opinion, is in a way the diametric opposite of heterodoxy, Greek, heterodox, variant opinion. Heterodoxy is a generic category used to refer to any and all doctrinal views at odds with mainstream thinking in a tradition. Heresy, from the Greek herio, to seize, choose, decide, in other words, to take a position, is one of the more common ways of characterizing heterodox views. In general, heresy refers to the deliberate holding of a set of beliefs in direct opposition to a religious tradition's established and widely accepted authority. It is important to keep in mind that fully articulated conceptions of orthodoxy typically develop long after the earliest generations of a given tradition have come and gone. During their early decades, even centuries in some cases, many religious traditions have historically allowed for some diversity of views. But one or another of those views can become so extreme that a majority of believers perceive a threat to their cohesiveness as a community. To hold such a threat at bay, religious communities sometimes find it necessary to define the limits of acceptable divergence of beliefs. The term heretical has sometimes been used to describe certain sectarian movements that form in response to restrictive definitions of orthodoxy.
What was the final solution?
In January 20, 1942, 15 Nazi bureaucrats met in the Berlin suburb of Grossen-Wannsee to discuss what they euphemistically termed the final solution to the Jewish question. The meeting was headed by SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich and included Adolf Eichmann among its attendees. A decision was made to evacuate every Jew in occupied Europe to camps in the east. There, they would be treated accordingly. The intention was to exterminate most Jews immediately upon arrival at the camps, but to identify some Jews for placement in organized labor battalions. Death would soon come to the laborers through starvation and overwork. The final solution was implemented ruthlessly and with great efficiency. Death camps were established throughout the East, with Poland as the principal center. The names of the camps: Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, Chelmno, Majdanek, Sobibor, Belzec, and many others are today instantly recognized for their connection with one of the darkest periods in human history.
Why are gender issues important in understanding religion?
Gender roles are significant everywhere on planet Earth, both religiously and socially. A common pattern is that gender roles deeply rooted in local custom gradually acquire religious justification. With the added weight of sacred authority, social change becomes considerably more traumatic and threatening. Especially in ostensibly male-dominated societies. Gender roles, both social and religious, have a great deal to do with the exercise of power. Religious rhetoric invariably canonizes the social status quo in the interest of greater stability, arguing that time-honored gender-based divisions of labor are divinely ordained. To tamper with the balance in quest of gender equality is to court disaster. Traditionalists argue, sweeping change is never easy, when it seems to imply major shifts in the exercise of religious authority, it can be excruciating. Dramatic realignments are afoot now all over the world, yielding slow improvements in the social standing of women and children. Those changes will inevitably manifest themselves in the social structures of religious communities everywhere. It is likely that 50 years hence scholars will be adding important new chapters to the history of religion. Chapters in which women's roles will be much more evident.
Must a Jew live in Israel? Similarly, what is the role and importance of a Jewish state? Of a concentration of Jews in a secular nation?
The establishment of the State of Israel in the wake of World War II renewed and shifted the debate. Today, the autonomy of Israel is accepted by many nations. But the debate concerning the rights of Arab settlers in Israel rages on.
Do all religious traditions send out missionaries?
Attitudes toward proselytizing, making converts, vary tremendously from one tradition to another. Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism are the three great missionary traditions. But within each of these there are considerable differences in emphasis on missionary activity. Some Christian groups support enormous mission operations, at least indirectly through private donation, all over the world. Other, generally smaller, groups make no attempt to mobilize their limited resources in order to proselytize. In between are Christians who consider it the ordinary duty of every believer to evangelize simply by sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. Muslims have also had a history of vigorous missionary work. Most Muslims consider inviting others to the faith a fundamental duty. In more recent times, however, Muslims have engaged in less widespread organized and institutionally funded missionary activity. Buddhist missionary work, especially between about 300 BCE and 600 CE, led to the spread of the faith from India throughout Central, East, and Southeast Asia. Today small-scale efforts continue, but are generally quite low-key. A few Hindu groups, such as the International Society for Krishna Consciousness and the Vedanta Society, have dedicated themselves in modern times to spreading their word. But on the whole, major missionary efforts have not been significant in other traditions.
What is the religion on the silver screen?
Ben-Hur, 1959. The third film version of the Lew Wallace classic stars Charlton Heston in the role of a Palestinian Jew battling the Roman Empire at the time of Christ. The breathtaking chariot race is spectacularly conceived and filmed. The Bible, in the beginning, 1966, brings to life the book of Genesis, including the stories of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, and Noah and the flood. All-star cast includes George C. Scott, Richard Harris, Stephen Boyd, Peter O'Toole, and Ava Gardner, David and Bathsheba. 1951, the Bible story comes alive in a lush and colorful production starring Gregory Peck and Susan Hayward. El Cid, 1961. Charts the life of Rodrigo Diaz de Bivar, known as El Cid, who was the legendary 11th-century Christian hero who freed Spain from Moorish invaders. A man for all seasons. 1966, heavily Oscar-honored biographical drama concerning the life and subsequent martyrdom of Sir Thomas More, 16th-century Chancellor of England. Paul Scofield's performance as More is considered one of the greatest ever of its kind. The Ten Commandments. 1956, Cecil B. DeMille's remake of his 1923 silent classic is a lavish epic about the life of Moses, who turned his back on a privileged life to lead his people out of bondage in Egypt. The sequence depicting the parting of the Red Sea is considered to rival any modern special effects.
What is the purpose of religious rituals?
Religious rituals function primarily to help believers establish relationships of presence, imagination, or memory with the spiritual. There is naturally some overlap among these three goals of ritual. Some rituals effect or mediate a connection between participants and a divine or spiritual presence.
What does the word conversion mean?
From the Latin convertere, meaning to turn about, conversion is a process of dramatic change. Religious conversion can mean a transfer of allegiance or membership from one religious tradition to another. When a conversion is formal or official, it can involve a repudiation of one's former beliefs. But it often means an affirmation of membership in the convert's new group. Many converts change from having no particular religious affiliation to active engagement in a community of faith. Recognition of a convert's acceptance into a new community varies widely. Some traditions require elaborate and lengthy preparation, including indoctrination in the new belief system, culminating in special ceremonies of initiation. Other traditions require minimal preparation and may mark a new member's acceptance with a simple welcoming announcement to the gathered congregation. Some traditions actively seek converts while others are not at all aggressive in this respect. Another kind of conversion is equally important. Great religious figures in many traditions talk of soul-shaking experiences that leave them searching for a new way of recommitting themselves spiritually. They often describe a dramatic change of heart that results not in their leaving one community of faith for another, but in a renewal and deeper understanding of their original faith commitments.
What is the freedom of religion in the 20th century?
In March of 1981, after more than 30 years of failed attempts, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights completed a draft declaration on the elimination of all forms of intolerance and of discrimination based on religion or belief. After approval by the Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, the declaration was adopted by the General Assembly on November 25. 1981. The declaration is a short document with 8 articles. It states that no one should be subject to discrimination on the grounds of religion or belief, that such discrimination should be condemned as a human rights violation, that states should act to prevent and eliminate such discrimination, and that the parents or legal guardians of a child have the right to organize life within the family in accordance with their religion or belief. Although religious liberty was deemed to be better protected by underspecification than by overspecification, the Declaration does enumerate 9 freedoms. Article 6 describes the right to freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief as including, but not limited to, the following freedoms: to worship or assemble in connection with a religion or belief and to establish and maintain places for these purposes, To establish and maintain appropriate charitable or humanitarian institutions. To make, acquire, and use to an adequate extent the necessary articles and materials related to the rites or customs of a religion or belief. To write, issue, and disseminate relevant publications in these areas. To teach a religion or belief in places suitable for these purposes. To solicit and receive voluntary financial and other contributions from individuals and institutions, to train, appoint, elect, or designate by succession appropriate leaders called for by the requirements and standards of any religion or belief. To observe days of rest and to celebrate holidays and ceremonies in accordance with the precepts of one's religion or belief, and to establish and maintain communications with individuals and communities in matters of religion or belief at the national and international levels.
What does the term liturgy mean?
The Greek word liturgia, from ergon, work, performed for the letos, people. Originally referred to various forms of public service and eventually came to be associated with priestly service of the gods. Because of the word's use in early Christian sources, it has become part of the religious studies lexicon. Liturgy now generally means any system of rituals mandated for public reenactment by members of a religious tradition. Its public nature separates liturgical action from private or devotional ritual. And since liturgical ritual is by definition required, it is further distinguished from the optional rituals associated with the individual expression of faith. Since liturgy is both communal and required, its performance presupposes some sort of scheduled predictability as well as facilities large enough to accommodate a whole community or segment thereof. Liturgical ritual is central to various Christian communities, Islam generally, and Judaism. Not every tradition's ritual life revolves around liturgy strictly so-called. For some communities a more piecemeal practice of individual or small group worship forms the dominant ritual theme, with larger communal events functioning as annual or occasional variations. Hindus, many Buddhists, and practitioners of Shinto gather for the equivalent of liturgical participation for special festivities, but they typically perform daily or otherwise regular rituals individually or in small groups at various times during the day. One practical result is that their staffs of ritual specialists may perform the same or very similar services many times a day throughout the year.
Were Jews ever ruled by a monarchy?
The thorny issue of monarchy arose during the later years of the Judges, c. 1200 to 1000 BCE, who ruled Israel after Joshua had led the establishment of the people in the newly reached promised land of Canaan. Some argued that Israel should be like all the surrounding lands, each ruled by its own king. They saw no other solution to the lawlessness they believed had overcome their land. Others held on to the conviction that embracing the institution of monarchy would amount to a betrayal of God's sovereignty. Saul was the first king, R 1020-1000. From his capital at Gilgal he succeeded in uniting the tribes against the common enemy, the Philistines. David, R 1000-961, established himself first at Hebron. But after taking Jerusalem from the Jebusites declared that city his capital. He sought to unify Jewish religious life and instituted the office of court prophet. David's son Solomon, R 961-922, further centralized Jewish ritual in his newly built Jerusalem temple. But when Solomon died his sons divided the realm into the northern kingdom of Israel, 922-721 BCE, and the southern kingdom of Judah, 922-586 BCE. 200 years later the northern capital of Samaria fell to the Assyrians, never to be recovered. The southern kingdom carried on for over a century, with moments of greatness and even major religious reform in the late 7th century BCE. Many of Israel's principal prophets lived and worked under the kingdom of Judah. But Babylon was putting the squeeze on the small kingdom. And in 586 BCE Jerusalem and its temple fell to invading forces. Over 1,000 years later, Jews founded the Khazar kingdom in the Caucasus. A small-scale experiment in monarchy that survived from about 700 to 1000.
What is a holy city and how do cities become holy?
Dozens of cities, towns, and villages across the globe have become especially sacred. Some places actually start off sacred. People acknowledge a place as the site of a unique revelatory event, often called a theophany, or divine manifestation. Some people choose to settle around the sacred site. Since holiness is often associated with natural features conducive to human habitation. Springs, rivers, fertile soil, settlements can develop and expand. Other sacred places begin unremarkably as centers of population and acquire their sacredness later. Often because a holy person has lived there. Whatever the genesis of a city's sacred character, people often come to believe that the place has always been holy. Over a period of centuries, a holy city may take on more and more religious associations, so that eventually believers regard it as the place where virtually everything of religious significance has happened. The holy city thus becomes a spiritual world unto itself. In a similar way, if believers perceive their holy city not only as the place where it all began but the place it will all come to an end, the city also becomes a microcosm of history. All power and even time itself comes into focus in this one place, this center of the universe. Though it may seem an affront to logic, this kind of symbolic religious cosmology sometimes finds room for more than one center. In other words, some traditions claim several sacred cities. often ranked hierarchically, but all uniquely sacred. This has its own logic, wherever believers gather. For whatever reason, there is the meeting place of heaven and earth.
What does geography have to do with religion?
A separate subdiscipline of religious studies called the geography of religion investigates how and why religious communities start and spread as they do. Geographers of religion don't just provide us with detailed maps that illustrate spatially where the world's major religious groups are and what percentages of a regional population belong to what tradition. They also study how people attach religious meanings to the physical circumstances in which they live and move. Practically every religious tradition has its sacred geography. Cartographers devise a number of different kinds of maps: physical, political, meteorological. Sacred geography results in what might be called spiritual maps. These spiritual maps exist first of all in the minds of religious believers, and reflect the distinctive perspective of their traditions. But we can also plot on paper how various religious traditions map their world. Places that are especially sacred to a particular community of faith provide believers with a unique kind of orientation to the larger world. In many instances, a special place functions as a spiritual center of the universe, so that everything revolves around it. That is not a measure of the place's actual importance, of course. For many sacred places are relatively insignificant politically and economically, and quite hard to reach physically. Many traditions eventually develop networks of holy places. Their holiness can derive from their association with events in the life of some sacred person, from the belief that some special event occurred there, or simply from the perception that a natural feature such as a tree or mountain or spring possesses unusual spiritual power. What is most important to keep in mind is that physical settings matter a great deal, and that religious traditions claim pieces of this earth as sacred to themselves.